there's often a criticism of Wright about writing for a white audience, but that was the audience at the time, and that was the audience he was trying to bring reality to as Martin Luther King with his demonstrations showed a lot of people that didn't know the conditions of the South. When Bull Connor started fire hosing people and beating people, it woke America up. And that, in a sense, was what Wright was trying to do before then with his books.
I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's program, France as Freedom, the Paris Years of Richard Wright. We couldn't be more honored to be joined by award-winning author, director, producer, and indie filmmaker Zachary James Miller, who will discuss the acclaimed author and activist Richard Wright. This will be a historical look at Wright's life and time in Paris, his legacy, along with his worth, both literary and political, in the times he lived in. Miller will be in conversation with Suffolk's own Francophile, Barbara Abrams, professor and chair, history, language, global culture, and philosophy department at Suffolk University. Zach Miller's works include two on the great American author Richard Wright. One is a biographical book called Richard Wright, Voice of Rebellion, and the other is the documentary film Richard Wright, Black Power, to be wrapped in October and soon after to begin its run at international film festivals. So it's now my pleasure to turn the mic over to Barbara, who has a quick anecdote about how she met Zach.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. We are very privileged to have Zach here today. And I just wanted to make a little comment about how this came about. Many of you attended the Simone de Beauvoir translation talk last year that was given by Connie Borde and Sheila Mulvaney-Chevalier. And I work in Paris, as many of you know, during the summers on my scholarly work in the archives, and I was having trouble translating something. And I called upon these two fabulous translators to meet with me to go over some of my work. And I said, let's go out for coffee. Meet me in this cafe. And so I say, sure. So I go over to this cafe. And I look in front and there's this whole stream of people with cameras and equipment and trucks. And I walk in and there is a table of people making a film together who are having lunch. And Connie and Sheila say, oh, I know these people. Of course, Connie and Sheila, some of you who know Connie and Sheila know everybody. And they said, let me introduce you to this fine group of people. And we went over to their table and sat down and started talking. And Zach has been very close friends with Connie and Sheila through the Democratic Party work that he does in Paris. And we got to talking and we realized that we had so much in common. And I said, you have to come speak at Suffolk University. And matter of fact, I really can find a link to my work in women's and gender studies because we are studying at the moment Toni Morrison's very famous book, Sula. And she really channels this relationship between James Baldwin and Richard Wright in her book, and in fact names her principal character after Richard Wright, and her name is Nell Wright, and my class has been studying this. So added to that, I want to say that we sat down and talked yesterday at lunch, and I realized that this is really a moment for the both of us, so I didn't want to let this go unmentioned or unnoticed that today is September 11th. It's an auspicious day for all of us who are alive at this time, and for those who don't have that experience, you know from previous generations how impactful this moment was. I see my direct colleague in the audience. This was our first day of work at Suffolk University. So Marjorie Salvadon and I started on 2001 9/11. So it's a day to mark for all of us. This marks our 25th year working together. And it happened to be the day that Zach moved to Paris. in 1990. So 1990s, the year he moved, but 9/11 was the date. So it's an anniversary of sorts, but then a bittersweet anniversary. And so I think we can take this event also and try to have an acknowledgement of those occasions. So with that, I'm going to leave you to talk about your work.
Thank you, Barbara. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. I'm very, very happy to see everyone here. I wanted to talk about Richard Wright's years primarily in Paris. Paris was salvation for Richard Wright. He had been moving all of his life, and he had a very interesting journey. What I want to talk about mostly, and what I talk about in my book, is his journey. The fact that a person arrives somewhere is of less importance to how far he had to come to get to where he was. What was interesting for me about Richard Wright was because he was so involved in literature. He as a child, he needed to learn things. He wanted to learn. He was starved for knowledge. And the fact that you have that in someone so young, and um, what he was doing in his young life was trying to get education. The very fact of him trying to get education was, in fact, a rebellion. That's why my book is entitled Voice of Rebellion. What I'll talk to you about right now, though, is basically how I first met, how I first got involved in all of this with Richard Wright. Um, as Barbara mentioned, I moved to Paris on September 11th of 1990. People ask me why I moved to Paris. I always tell people that I was kidnapped by a French woman. And that's almost the truth. We've been together ever since, and we have a 25-year-old son who is currently living in Washington, D.C. But I had no idea that I would be coming to Paris. When we first originally came, we thought we'd just be there for a year and then return to the U.S. where we had met. But Paris can grab a hold of you. And I loved it there, and we just decided to stay. I changed my professions from being a psychologist to being I don't know what I do. But eventually, within a year or two, I figured out I wanted to do films. And so I commuted a lot to London, where a burgeoning indie film movement was happening. There was my friend Elliot Grove, who later was to start Raindance Film Festival, which is persisting until today. I was one of the people at the beginning of that. And we all learned our skills in filmmaking as a little group in London. And that's what I ultimately started doing from Paris. Now, around 92, I'd had a little success with a jazz series, American jazz musicians in Europe. I really wanted to do a series on writers, which proved to be less compelling to the channels than music. They wanted me to keep doing music. I did jazz. They wanted me to do blues. I wanted to do Richard Wright and Ernest Hemingway. And I was in love with writing. I loved writers. And in my pursuit of that idea of doing a Richard Wright, I wanted to do a Richard Wright documentary first. I had a friend who worked for Michel Fabre. Now, Michel Fabre was one of the biographers of Richard Wright. He was a professor and head of the Black Culture Studies at the Sorbonne in Paris. Because of her, our mutual friend, I met Michelle, and Michelle introduced me to the family. So I met Richard Wright's widow and his daughter, Julia. Now, we became friends. Julie and I are still friends, along with her children, Malcolm and Ellen. And we have persisted in that time to try and get more information out about Richard Wright. I actually was given the IP for the books Black Boy and American Hunger, the memoirs, the biographies that Richard Wright wrote. We have not been successful in getting the level of production we want to do that kind of mini series or feature film with actors portraying Richard Wright. But in the meantime, I decided to write this book that I've written and to do my small documentary. So that's what's happening now. What we're talking about right now, we're looking at his journey, part of which took place between 1908, his birth, and 1927, which is more of the Southern years. And then when he really started, when his powers as a writer really became noticed was in 1927 through 1940, and then his time in Paris between 1947 and 1960. And then we're talking a little bit about his legacy. Now, Richard Wright initially left uh, to go to Chicago when he was 19 years old. He became part of what's called the John Reed Club. And one amazing thing that was happening too was he got his first story published. Now, he had always been interested in literature, always been interested in writing, and had struggled to learn how to read. Fortunately, his mother was one of the rare Black exceptions. She was a Black woman who actually knew how to read at the time, and that was a boon to her son Richard. But Richard's mother's health was not great, and at a time he had to be taken care of by other relatives, and which might have motivated him to to leave. So this is what I wanted to talk about initially here. Wright's first lesson in terror. Uh, in 1916, 8-year-old Richard Wright's world was shattered when his great uncle Silas Hoskins was lynched by white men in Elaine, Arkansas. Hoskins owned a successful salon, too successful for white tolerance. His prosperity became his death sentence. Richard Wright writes in Black Boy, Uncle Hoskins led simply been plucked from our midst, and we figuratively had fallen on our faces to avoid looking into the white hot face of terror that we knew loomed somewhere above us. Having his great uncle lynched was, of course, a blow to Wright. They fled Arkansas with the clothes on their back. And then in 1919, although 3 years after Uncle Hoskins' murder, the Elaine massacre erupted. White mobs and federal troops slaughtered hundreds of Blacks who were demanding fair wages for cotton picking, of being sharecroppers cotton picking. We don't know exact death count. It's between 200 and 800 and something. But Wright was extremely upset about that. And in his anger, and he was also angry about the response to that. There was an implied weakness he felt, a cowardice, in fact, that there was no response. We were just, and his I think it was his uh, aunt who was upset by his reaction and slapped him because of his reaction, because she knew it would endanger his life. Now, that was, of course, in 1919. But what was also happening in 1919, that was called the Red Summer Massacre. But that same year, in cities across America, there were Red Summers, not only in Elaine, Arkansas. One I recount in another documentary of the Black American painter, Buford Delaney, was the Red Summer that he experienced in Knoxville, Tennessee. Same year, same circumstances. The Red Summers of 2019 were in many cities. 1919 was the main year, but there were other years around that time frame where there were Red Summers in various cities. Now, for Wright, this other blow happening 3 years after his uncle's assassination was very, very devastating. He was, in a way, seeking to escape. but to escape not only the place, but the mindset. Now, when I'm talking about the mindset, I'm talking about the mindset of he saw people around him. Um, I saw that a little bit in my first trip to Tuskegee to visit my relatives. I talk about this a little bit in the book. I was 10 or 11 years old, living in Akron, Ohio. My parents, my father was a factory worker. Factory workers made okay money, good unions at the time. And we had to go to Tuskegee at one point uh, to my uncle's funeral. So we got in the car, drove from Akron, Ohio to Tuskegee, Alabama. And the one thing I noticed while we were driving down was my father wasn't stopping. He wasn't stopping anywhere. And I was saying, Daddy, there's a motel. Hey, Daddy, there's a motel. He wasn't stopping. I did not know why we weren't stopping. I found out later we couldn't stop because there were no motels that would allow us to stay there. So that was the childhood that I had as a northern child, that I was aware I was Black, but I apparently didn't know what that involved. So we were just going on our way, and that was happening. And he stopped, pulled over the road at some point and rested, and then, took a little half an hour nap, then continued driving. And I was perplexed by why we didn't stop at a motel. But that was the mentality I was coming from in Akron, Ohio. Now, when I got to Tuskegee, me and my cousin, my northern cousin, met our southern cousins, and we, like all kids, were happy to see cousins we didn't really know. And we uh, did some things together, went to a movie, went to a candy shop. So in the candy shop, my cousin and I were both very comical. We liked to play. And so we decided it would be a bright idea to do our voices, because we love doing accents, we love doing imitations. And he and I started doing our little Southern accent while we were in the store buying candy from the white woman who was a candy shop owner. And my Southern cousins were alarmed, to say the least, that we were doing this. We were just playing. We had no idea that you could get in trouble doing that. Nobody had told us that. Um, but they were aware of that. They had that knowledge. We didn't. So when we went back home, they told on us and we were scolded. And for doing that, we were totally unclear about that. Uh, but they had in them ingrained knowledge of behavior with white people that we were not taught in Akron, Ohio. That kind of thing was what Richard Wright was rebelling against, because he knew he had the same knowledge, but he wanted to rebel against the idea of having to look down and not have eye contact with white people when you saw them. He knew there was something wrong about that. And that kind of compelled him to, even in the face of possible danger, to defy those kinds of standards. Now, I was later to learn, uh, much later actually, to learn that the fear that my cousins and my relatives experienced or expressed was, in fact, very, very real, because a year earlier, my father's cousin, who you may or may not have heard about, but he's historic in that there's a book written about him, Sammy Young Jr., my father's cousin, was assassinated himself for using a white restroom. He was shot in the back of the head while getting back on the Greyhound bus after using a white restroom. So that was the kind of reality that they were faced with. That was the knowledge that they knew that I had no knowledge of. And that's the kind of thing that Richard Wright was rebelling against his entire life. So his journey leaves there. He goes to Chicago. He This is more about the being born into fire. I'll read his quote here. I was born into a world that told me I was nothing, and I spent my life proving them wrong. So you see, that was his journey. That was his fierce determination to be successful, to learn, to gain knowledge. We take too often for granted the privilege we have in being able to learn things. Right now, I told, when my son was growing up, I told him, you have the world at your fingertips with the computer, with the internet, with all the knowledge you can gain. And now with AI, I mean, the things that we have, all of this available to us. And Richard Wright had none of that. He had to scheme in order to get a library card, to get a library book out of a library. He had to work hard and think cleverly and ways of how to how in fact to learn, how to get knowledge. Here we talk more about the Great Migration. And he says, books became my weapons against ignorance and my shield against despair. So that led him to be part of the migration at age 19, to flee the South to Chicago with dreams of freedom and education. Chicago's South Side offered new possibilities, but familiar racism. Wright discovered the public library, his gateway to intellectual liberation. He wanted to study all these people. He wanted to read about Sinclair. He began writing poetry and short stories. He joined literary groups and writing circles. He was trying to educate himself in spite of the racism that had followed him to the North. The Great Depression radicalized Wright. He joined the Communist Party, believing revolution could destroy American racism. The party gave Wright a platform, an audience, but demanded ideological conformity that stifled his artistic vision. Key works during this period: Uncle Tom's Children in 1938, Native Son, 1940, 12 Million Black Voices, 1941. By 1944, Wright realized the party sought him as a propaganda tool, not as an artist, and he chose literary freedom over political orthodoxy. He says, I thought communism would free Black people. Instead, it tried to chain my mind. In 1938 was Wright's first literary victory. Uncle Tom's Children won the Story Magazine contest, Wright's first major literary breakthrough. Goes on, and he says, I found that I'd written a book which even bankers' daughters could read and weep over and feel good about. I wrote to show white America what they had done to us and what we might do back. There's often a criticism of Wright about writing for a white audience, but that was the audience at the time, and that was the audience he was trying to bring reality to, as Martin Luther King, with his demonstrations, showed a lot of people that didn't know the conditions of the South. When Bull Connor started fire hosing people and beating people, it woke America up. And that, in a sense, was what Wright was trying to do before then with his books. By the way, also, one of the esteemed guests of people who have visited Wright in his apartment in Paris was, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, Julia talks about in their apartment, it was a beautiful apartment. They had a kind of a den office for Richard. And most times when a visitor would come, Wright would take him into the den and talk with him, and the door was left open. Julia says the only time that the door was closed was when Martin Luther King came to visit. He closed the door and they had a private conversation. And I don't know if that had anything to do with the fact that they were both being spied on, or if he just wanted to keep some things from the children. But that was the case that she recounts. So Native Son came out in 1940. It was an explosive novel about Bigger Thomas that shocked white America. And that was his breakthrough. That was his major breakthrough. It became the first best-selling book of the month club, best-selling book for a Black author. It sold over 200,000 copies in 3 weeks. It was a bestseller for 16 weeks. It eventually sold 500,000 copies soon after that. And then 1945, Black Boy, the autobiography that shook America. So he talks about that, his life, and that first part, autobiography. Later on, he writes American Hunger, which is about the second part of his life. But this mostly takes place in the South. I would hurl words into this darkness and wait for an echo. And if an echo sounded, no matter how faintly, I would send other words to tell, to march, to fight. So you see, Wright saw his words as a weapon. He saw his words as meaning something. He was trying to do something more than create literary excellence, although that was his goal as well. He was trying to, he wrote political books. He wrote books that wanted to change people's minds about something. So here, he's moved from Chicago to New York. He's celebrated. He is talk of the town. He's becoming wealthy. He has maids, he has nannies. This is an incident that happened at a famous store, Bergdorf Goodman in New York. Um, this right here is kind of, Wright didn't take his daughter actually. It was a nanny that took his daughter to Julia shopping in a New York department store. When Julia needed to go to the restroom, the nanny asked someone, "Where's the restroom?" And the woman directs the white nanny to where the restroom is, and then she sees that this little colored girl, and she says, "No, no, 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 she can't go to the restroom." And so Wright's daughter, Julia, who's a small child at this point, is denied going to the restroom. At this point, Wright, when he hears this, when they get back and he hears this, that his daughter Julia had to leave the hotel, and the woman had to take Julia into the park, to use the restroom. He is incensed. He is inflamed. He is upset. That was the last straw, and that's when they decided to move to France. He says in the book, "Will not raise my daughter in a country that tells her she is not human enough to use the bathroom." So in May 1947, Wright moves to Paris. In Paris with his daughter Julia and Ellen, uh, he feels relaxed. He feels free. He's happy. He says, "I'm not a problem here. I simply am a man." But in a sense, though, he was more than a man. He was celebrated. Paris loved Wright. They welcomed him, and he was very happy there initially. He was happy with the city, with the people, the freedom he felt, and the friends he met. He met, as we mentioned, Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. He became his friends. He was the talk of the town. He had a beautiful life there, and that was another intellectual awakening. He says, "Here I can think without looking over my shoulder." Now, as his fame grew, other writers were influenced by him. Other writers wanted to make the journey to meet with him. He had supported James Baldwin. James Baldwin arrived in Paris as his protege, but soon became a rival. What happened was, and we talk about it extensively in my documentary, was Baldwin came to. He actually didn't come. He actually saw Wright when he soon after he got to Paris in a cafe, and he came over, and Wright is meeting with an editor. And the fact is that Wright was happy to see Baldwin, and Baldwin actually wanted to borrow money. So that was that. But Baldwin needed money, and Wright was meeting with an editor at the time, and suggested to the editor, introducing Baldwin to the editor, suggested that he give him a job. And so the editor gave Baldwin a job writing an essay. Well, this essay turned out to be an attack on Wright. And the next meeting after that, there were you'll see more about this in the documentary, but the what was interesting was Wright still loaned him a considerable amount of money for the time, and when he still needed money the second time they met, when they had that argument. So, but that feud grew when a second essay was even more venom was produced by Baldwin against Wright, and it was a kind of a literary father and son conflict. It was the idea that the son has to destroy the father. The son has to, make his own way in a sense. Uh, as Baldwin said, you wrote my story first, but I have to tell it my way. But in a sense, there was a thought also at the time that there can only be one. Just like in the science fiction show, there can only be one. And so he had to be the black writer. There could only be one black writer that America would consider at a given point. And that point, it was Richard Wright. And Baldwin wanted to be the next. And the situation is, as Baldwin grew older, other writers of the later days attacked him in the same way, to jump on his shoulders and go above him. So that was an unfortunate thing, but that was the situation it was. So in the 50s, Baldwin Wright started expanding his vision. He started going around Indonesia, Spain, Ghana, Africa, various parts of the world, talking about America and trying to bring the diaspora together in a sense. That even made more fodder for J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and the CIA to be concerned about. Um, and Wright was looking at racism not only in America but around the world. He said racism is not just America's problem; it's the white world's weapon of control. Because he felt that Africa was being taken over. He talked about the colonization. He was very adamant about um, trying to bring global racism to an end and bring a global power to Black people. In fact, he wrote a book called Black Power, which most people didn't know because most people associated that with Stokely Carmichael years later. The term Black Power was originated by Richard Wright and later incorporated by Stokely Carmichael. Here we go, talking about the years that from 1947 to his death in 1960 when he was being watched. Wright says, they followed me across an ocean. America's racism has no barriers. He was, and generally the FBI and the CIA do not work together. But in some rare cases, this collaboration kind of happened because the spying started with J. Edgar Hoover, but J. Edgar Hoover's reach doesn't extend across the borders, but the CIA's does. And so the CIA took up the slack when Wright got to Paris. So we talk a little bit about Richard Gibson, who was the one of the main spies for the CIA. This is information about that. I actually met Richard Gibson on 2 occasions. We it was it was thought of by the American community in Paris that Richard Gibson was a spy. He was accused of being a spy, but there's never any proof until documents were declassified in 2017. Before that, I had met with them at a small dinner and then on a canal trip. I, at that time, believed the fact that he was that he was a spy, and later we were fine. We found out for real. So, 1960, Wright died at the age of 52, officially from a heart attack. He had an amoeba that he was being treated for. He his death was sudden. He was recovering. He was at a different hospital. He usually would go to the American hospital. He was at a different hospital with a different doctor, and he suddenly died. And there has been mystery around that for a long time. Um, Wright's daughter, Julia, um, does feel to this day that her father was killed. Michel Fabre, the one of the main biographers, he doesn't feels there's no conclusive proof to that fact, so he doesn't feel that's the case. Ollie Harrington, who was Wright's closest friend at the time, left Paris immediately after that and went to Berlin, and he feels Wright was killed. I met Ollie Harrington also in the early '90s before he died, and basically the jury's out whether he was killed or whether he died of a heart attack while in the hospital. It's a mystery. So here we have just about the legacy, like Wright's legacy that Julia and her son Malcolm and her daughter Ellen are trying to preserve and continue.
Thank you so much. So we have a few minutes for questions, comments for Zach. And I want to thank you again for this wonderful history. And it actually has a lot to do with things that we're studying in our class. I know for me, it's especially meaningful because I am from the south side of Chicago, and Native Son was in our freshman reading class in high school, and there was always lively discussion. But I'm going to leave it to my students first, and then maybe I'll do the follow-up question, which I've had since I was about 13 years of age
Okay.
about this book. But do we have some comments, questions, observations from people here?
Thank you. I'm not a student, but I am from the general community, and
Welcome.
I'm glad to be here today. I thought this was a fantastic talk. There were so many things that I didn't know about Richard Wright, but I too read him back many moons ago in high school days. But I would love to know a little bit more about how you think Wright's time in Paris informed his later writing, and what would he think about us discussing him right now, if he could?
Well, I he actually became he Paris did make him evolve. He became part of the the movement of existentialism, which Jean-Paul Sartre and other Parisians at the time were part of and thinking about. His books probably changed. You can see some of that. To some, they feel that um, he was afraid to go back to America because he knew that there was a strong possibility that if he went back to America, his passport would be taken. So he didn't have that same connection with the US anymore. So he was being informed by what he was learning in Paris and in his travels. But there was a different South that was changing while he was away. So in a sense, he was getting his information from afar. It's different now. I mean, you can be anywhere in the world and be still connected everywhere. But during that time, of course, you couldn't. So I think, he was becoming more French, more Parisian, but more of a citizen of the world. And so that changed his writing. That changed his, you know, ideas about things, I think. Now I think he would be very happy that we're still studying him. But he'd probably be saddened by where we still are with race relations, with general uh, society in general. You always think that a society is going to make massive changes, but you get 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That seems to be the way of things. So freedom is never free. You have to fight for it every day, and that's what probably Wright would observe.
We have time for just a couple more questions or comments. Great.
I can project my voice
No,
on
you
the
need to-
teacher.
you need
For the Zoom, okay, for the Zoom. Hi, my question is about global Black solidarity, and it comes from a very personal and also intellectual place. As Barbara said, we helped found the French Studies program here. because I'm thinking of the decolonial movements in the French Caribbean, what is called the French quote unquote Caribbean, right? So Martinique, Guadeloupe, Haiti. And those people went to metropolitan France. And I'm wondering if in Wright's time, what his relationship were to the Black Caribbean people who were also, some of whom were communists as well, Aimé Césaire and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us more about the relationship. And in terms of, I'm thinking of it through the lens of a global Black solidarity in this time when colonialism is being, called into question, and in many ways France is being pushed to stop doing what it's been doing in terms of colonizing countries in the Caribbean.
Yeah, Wright, along with his French literary friends like Sartre, were very much involved in the efforts to decolonize. But the thing was, also, they were on a kind of a tricky path because there was also a fear that you could be deported, you could be made to leave France if you were talking bad about France as an American. If you were pursuing any kind of revolutionary behavior, even to the fact of writing letters or something about what France is doing in Africa or anywhere else. So the thing, actually, there's a very interesting story. There was a trick by Richard Gibson, the spy, who was infiltrated part of the Black community. There was a Cafe Tournon, where everybody met at, and there was a fight, an actual physical fight between Ollie Harrington and Richard Gibson, when Ollie Harrington found out that Richard Gibson had written a letter under the name of Ollie Harrington, condemning France for its efforts in, the whole, I don't know what was it, French colony? Anyway, it was yeah. So that condemnation of France could have gotten Ollie Harrington kicked out of the country. And that was the point. And some say it was not on, this part was not on behalf of the CIA. This part was on behalf of Richard Gibson wanting his apartment. So that it could come down to petty things like that, Yeah. But yeah, later on it was found, like I said, in 2017, and confirmed by Newsweek and I think The Guardian, about how much he was being paid. He was being paid like $900 a month to report on the Black community and to the CIA when those files were declassified in 2017. And $900 doesn't sound like a much now, but back then it was like $9,000. So it was a good salary.
So, Zach, we have queued up the raw footage from the documentary. I'm wondering if you can introduce it, give us a little bit of background for the footage.
Okay, well, this, like I said, is raw footage. I just show you some clips of what we're doing here. Most of it is a conversation, and this part is a conversation between two scholars of Richard Wright, and both my friends. Jake Lamar is in Paris. He's been my friend since he moved to Paris 2 years after me, and Frank is a scholar who teaches at the University of Mississippi. He's from Mississippi, and he teaches a class there on Richard Wright. And most of this is in conversation with them.
So we're sitting here in the Café Les Deux Magots, which has this huge importance in the story of Richard Wright and James Baldwin. I'll tell you what I know about this, and you tell me what you know about it.
Okay. All right.
Richard Wright arrives in Paris, settles in Paris in 1946-47. He arrives, he is the most famous, critically acclaimed, commercially successful African-American writer in history, thanks to Native Son, published in 1940, and Black Boy, published in 1945. He comes to Paris, and in 1948, his young protege from New York, James Baldwin, arrives. Baldwin is in his early 20s. He's broke. Wright had gotten him a grant to help him write Go Tell It on the Mountain, the novel that would become Go Tell It on the Mountain. The book was turned down all over New York. So Baldwin arrives in Paris, broke, obscure, miserable, and his first morning here sees Richard Wright sitting at this cafe with an editor, the editor of Zero magazine, which was this English language literary magazine. Baldwin can't believe his luck. Here's Richard Wright sitting right here. Baldwin's been in Paris for a couple of hours. Here's his mentor sitting at the Dumago. Wright is saddened to hear about Baldwin's rejections everywhere. Says to the editor, give Baldwin a job. Hire him to write an essay. Baldwin, all excited, writes this essay, everybody's protest novel. Maybe you should take it from here. Tell us about that essay.
The essay really begins talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin. And you think that it's really this criticism of Uncle Tom's Cabin, then all of a sudden it changes and it goes into a criticism of Native Son and of the character of Bigger Thomas. And, Bigger Thomas almost being the son, shall we say, of Uncle Tom, bigger than Thomas. And the criticism, as I see it, is that, this is almost pathologizing blackness, is what Baldwin is accusing Wright of doing in the novel Native Son, which becomes something that is a criticism that really sticks with Richard Wright for a very long time. I think well into after his death and into the 1970s, when it's really picked up by feminist literary critics. And slowly in the United States, Wright's work falls out of favor.
Yeah.
So that's the way that I kind of see Everybody's Protest novel. It has it is an essay that stung in the moment, but also had a very long tail of influence.
Yeah. Well, I'm fascinated by the personal dynamic here. So Wright
I
is
am
this,
as well.
Wright is this, this monument, in 1948, when young Baldwin gets this assignment for Everybody's Protest novel. And Baldwin, the essay is attacking the protest novel as a form, the protest novel being the politically engaged novel. And Baldwin's point, Baldwin, who loves Henry James and considers himself a bit of an aesthete, Baldwin is like, oh no, this politically engaged fiction, often these novels are just really bad. And he uses Uncle Tom's Cabin as the example of the very worst of protest fiction. And
which
then
it is.
Which it is. But then at the end, it's just like this paragraph towards the end of the piece where he brings up Native Son and basically says Bigger Tom is flesh of his flesh. He says flesh of Uncle Tom's flesh. Basically the flip side of the same racist cliche. Now, across the street is the Brasserie Lippe. Back in 1948, all these places were affordable. The French economy was still trashed after the war. So, this place, Brasserie Lippe across the street, these are places where, broke writers hung out, and general writers in the community. So Richard Wright is sitting in Brasserie Lippe reading Zero magazine, reading this essay, Everybody's Protest Fiction, when Baldwin walks in. According to Baldwin, Wright tears into him. It's like, I helped you, where'd you get off writing this? This is blah, blah, blah. He's yelling at him. Baldwin says he was tongue-tied, had no response. What does Baldwin do? 2 years later, he writes a second essay, Many Thousands Gone, which is a 20-page demolition of Native Son. And as you were saying, Baldwin's his critique is not wrong. for me, the thing about Many Thousands Gone is the tone of that piece. It's just dripping with sarcasm.
And it's as if Many Thousands Gone. I mean, I think he stabs him in the gut in Everybody's Protest novel, and then he's basically saying, I am claiming my own literary patrimony free of you.
We have two questions that I do want to get to you. So the first is, could it be that James Baldwin and Richard Wright were purposely pitted against each other, maybe to deter the solidarity of Black writers and to create animosity among Black writers?
Well, clearly, one of the goals of the FBI and CIA at the point was to break up the community of Black people in Paris. So whether that particular thing was about that, it was clearly a goal of destroying the solidarity, and it did achieve its goal because there was lack of trust. Nobody knew who was a spy, who wasn't a spy. That it did break down the solidarity to a large degree. Whether or not this particular incident was a part of that is unknown, but yeah, that was one of the goals, and it made life uncomfortable for a lot of them who had a brilliant community beforehand.
And then the second question is, Julia has told the story of hearing in Paris of the execution of the Rosenbergs in 1953. Do you have comments on Wright and that event?
I don't really have comments on that. Julia's talked about that, but I really don't really have no real idea about how Wright's involvement in that, or what he would say about that.
Hello. Okay. So my question was pertaining to like the Black victimhood, and especially when it came down to like how everyone was criticizing Native Son. So I was wondering kind of like what Black Parisians were thinking. Like, did they like it? Did they not like it? Like, did they like the fact that like he was living in Paris? In his books, like, did they kind of like um resonate with his experiences of the South in a different way? That's kind of like my thoughts, or at least my question was like, how did Black people in Paris perceive him?
Um, well, basically, Black people in Paris really loved Richard Wright. In fact, all of Paris really loved Richard Wright at the time when he was living there. Um, and even today, I would venture that he's more studied in Paris schools than he is in American schools. Part of that maybe because of the the censorship of his work here to some degree. But yeah, my son went to school, French basic elementary school before he went to a public international school in Paris, and they were studying Richard Wright at a young age. And there was even a book that I got my son actually, that was very popular in Paris, but about Richard Wright in the library card for like young ones, So yeah, there was always been a kind of an honored place in France for writers in general. But Richard Wright came with the additional honor of being this political activist. And yeah, so that was Black Parisians responded to him very well, I think.
Can I just add one thing to
Mhm.
that? There was an exhibit this last summer
Mhm.
in the Pompidou Center of
Mhm.
Paris Noir, and I was struck by how James Baldwin always seemed to be taking the limelight in that exhibit. There would be a little bit on Wright, and then all of a
Yeah.
sudden the camera would switch, even in the documentaries that they posted throughout the exhibit. So I'm wondering if there isn't a shift of attention now because James Baldwin has captured at least the recaptured the young American audience. I wonder if there's more of a trend now towards reading Baldwin because he's more radical and he's also a proponent of the LGBTQ plus rights. So I'm just wondering if Zyra's not onto something here, that maybe there is a shift from Wright to Baldwin because
Well,
of this.
there is, but the one reason about that too is Baldwin did a lot of media
Oh, that's
Baldwin
true.
was in the era where there was a lot more media, and you can see clips of Richard Wright speaking in French a little bit, but you don't have the same kind of media, and that lasts.
True.
That in fact, I'm doing this other documentary on Buford Delaney, who was there at the same time and very close to James Baldwin. There is absolutely nothing on him. He didn't do media. I see him. I've got like a couple clips of him. Um, they're in his apartment, him and James Baldwin talking to some students, and they're in Delaney's apartment, but Baldwin is doing all the talking.
Yeah.
But no, he was just much more media savvy, and he's got some great footage with William F. Buckley Jr. in that show,
Yeah.
and there's talk at the Cambridge Union. He was
He was
media
everywhere.
savvy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did just have a question about the public schools. So I remember reading Black Boy, 1973, 10th grade. At what grades was did they usually assign Richard Wright in our public schools? And would I have read that book, Black Boy, in 1983, 10 years later, for
Oh.
example?
And you're talking about in the U.S.?
US.
Okay. In the U.S., I read it in junior high school. I don't know. I have no idea how it's being read in the States now.
I've asked my students, and actually they haven't been offered Richard Wright in
Yeah.
high school. So,
Yeah.
um,
That's kind of my knowledge, is that it's not read here as much,
yes.
and that it's been placed on a list to a lot of places to be censored. So yeah, that's the situation here now. It's still read in Paris.
Hi, thank you so much. Did he have a relationship with Ralph Ellison? That's part one, and part two are his books being banned in some of the libraries in the US today, given what's going on?
To the second part of the question, yes, absolutely. I talk about that in the introduction of my book, where it's being banned right now, where it's banned in lots of schools, banned in prisons,
told you.
banned in a lot of places, both Native Son and Black Boy. To your other question, Ralph Ellison, they knew each other. They spoke highly of each other. I don't know how much of a personal relationship they had, but they did, Thanks.
Well, we've unfortunately run out of time. I want to thank you so much, Zach. Thank you. Barbara, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. And thank you to our Zoom audience.
Thank you.